All right. So now onto the Declaration of Independence. So what's interesting about the Declaration is it has embedded in it this idea of equality before the law. This idea of political equality between people. And it also has this pursuit of happiness, like this idea of human striving, human flourishing, the idea that things could get better, which is radical in 1776. I mean, for most of human history, as we've covered, the standard of living has not increased. So, generally things are the same. And so this is a very much an Enlightenment idea coming from the Enlightenment that things can be improved, that human beings can improve their station, that through better forms of government, control of nature, that they can actually raise their standard of living, that the government can set the conditions that allow for human flourishing. So these are all important ideas and kind of embedded. If you think about the history of the U.S. of the United States, this is kind of these are the big ideas that attract people to it, that you can improve your station. You can go to the US and you can do better for yourself and your family, that you are free to pursue your own, your happiness, your self-interest. And there is, at least in the text, although not, of course, not always guaranteed, some level of equality. The text itself is rather actually quite striking. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. All right, so this is the US saying, look, we are going to separate off. Okay, we have had enough. We are going to remove ourselves from Britain. Okay, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Note, believe the reading this that covers that this, when they say men, they mean humans. Okay, there's a very good bit of historical scholarship to note that this men right here means both men and women. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that wherever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem the most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So it's like, look, we can form our own government that's better at guaranteeing the safety and happiness of the population, or the pursuit of happiness. It's not guaranteeing happiness. I mean, no government can guarantee happiness, but like essentially providing those conditions that are most likely to lead to human flourishing. Okay, so it's a rather radical document. All right, now, of course, in reality, so we have the ideals of the Declaration. The ideals, so the Declaration is more of like a philosophical document, thinking about what is the overall role of government, what are these inalienable rights that everyone's endowed with, and then the Constitution, which is really laying the foundation for the economic activity that will come in the 1800s. Okay, so you kind of have these philosophical ideas from the Declaration, economic ideas from the Constitution. Okay, so these are our founding documents, and they're very important, in my opinion, um, because essentially it makes the US kind of unique in that through most of human history up to this point, nation states or civilizations are based on an ethnic identity, in that, these are like groups of people who are bonded together by like culture and language. In the US, although, obviously not perfect, but the US basically, what it became over 200 years is like the founding is like these documents. The founding are these ideas. This is a shared heritage for everyone here, and anybody who comes here can share in this heritage. If you think back to 2016, there's the father of a soldier who had died in the Afghanistan war, I believe. He like had the Constitution in his pocket when he was giving a speech at the DNC, where he like held up the Constitution. It's like anybody can adopt these documents as like the founding documents. Okay, anybody can come and become an American. All right, anybody can come and immigrate here. Obviously, the immigration rules have changed over time. In this time period, they are very open, in that in the 1800s, they're largely, anybody can come. All right. Now, of course, the ideal versus the reality is very different, but the documents are very important because they kind of set the stage for the U.S. and then the idea that people can come and take this up as their shared heritage, and that's not based on, some sort of tribal group way back in the past, as most countries were. Now, countries obviously have changed in the present, but traditionally, the France is for the French. Um, you know, um, Vietnam is for the Vietnamese. All right. And there are ethnic minorities in these countries, but they are largely kind of, treated as something different. The ideal for the US is, anybody can come and adopt this shared heritage. Again, the reality, though, is much different, you know. And so we think about these institutions and how important they are, but you see from the very beginning how differentially they are applied. Private property. Okay, private property is at the heart of any market economy. Obviously, the Native American property rights are not respected. The land is stolen throughout. Native Americans are displaced time and time again. Their contracts are not honored. So the private property is not extended to the groups that are living here. Private property is not extended to slavery, to the victims of slavery, to the slaves that are brought here. They're not even given private property over their own labor. And so you have these ideals, and the U.S. fails to live up to these ideals, especially with these populations, the Native American population, the slaves, and the descendants of slaves. Okay, you have the Jim Crow era. After that, you have civil forfeiture, that kind of goes up to the present of these differential application of the high-minded, idealistic institutions. Okay. And so if you're thinking about these institutions as kind of necessary conditions, you can also look at the differential application of them as part explanation for differences in economic outcomes between the groups. So this is where this differential applications of the institutions is really where the U.S. has faltered throughout its history. And there's a lot of tension there. So there's a lot of elements. There are people who say the documents are inherently flawed and need to be thrown out. And you see that in the reading this week playing out between Frederick Douglass and Lloyd Garrison. So you can see that debate goes back into the 1800s, and who gets access to these institutions is a constant battle. Interestingly enough, the U.S. has actually, at least in terms of economic success, immigrants throughout U.S. history have been able to move up the ladder. Again, it's not perfect, but if you look at the mobility data, if you look at kind of one generation compared to the next, immigrants have really been able to come to the U.S. and thrive. This is true in the 1800s. This is true in the 1900s. This is true in the 2000s. Your economically most successful groups in the present are children of immigrants. In the present, it's like Indian Americans, Iranian Americans, Nigerian Americans, Cuban Americans. So these are all immigrant groups. A variety of immigrant groups are the most economically successful. So the institutions, at least in immigration, have seemed to, obviously there are exceptions. There are examples of, atrocities, but in general, the institutions have kind of done a somewhat good job of incorporating immigrants throughout the 200 and so year history of the U.S., at least in terms of economic growth, economic success of these groups. The mobility rates are actually higher than natives throughout the 20th century for immigrants. And again, those rules around immigration and who can come here do change a lot. We have a different set of rules in the 1800s. Those change in the 1920s. Essentially have the borders are closed for non-white immigrants. There's very, very small allotments from the 1920 to 1965, I believe. 1965, they get reformed. The borders get opened up a bit post 65. Anyways, that's a subject of a whole immigration lecture, but I don't know. It's just something to think about. All right. Like I said, the reading this week will really kind of delve into these contradictions more. We have a bunch of readings from Danielle Allen's book on the Declaration of Independence, then a chapter on Frederick Douglass and Lloyd Garrison's fight, essentially their argument about the Constitution. And then you have a podcast kind of profiling Lisa Cook, who did work on patents and the history of who gets access to the patent system throughout kind of her research focused on late 1800s, early 1900s. All right, there we go. That'll be it for this week.